Thanks to everybody who's watching and listening. I mean, this is probably the most horrendously busy autumn semester in living memory. So I appreciate you sparing any time to come and watch today. And I guess that's one good thing about the Zoomification of academic life right now, is that there's if there's one plus, it's the fact that we can access events that we might otherwise have a chance to attend. And I'm certainly not a disciple of the new normal evangelism that's sweeping the country, but I think that actually I can see that this is one of the silver linings, I guess, of our current moment. Before I get going, though, please allow me to indulge this image of Rachel Clarke on the right. She'll be one of my lodestones for this talk. And in the wake of last week's events, one would hope that her kind of placard here is no longer warranted, but I don't think we're quite out of the woods yet when it comes to the threat of healthcare's commercialization. So I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon, even if Trump's economic imperialism hopefully will. But I want to begin by begin in a slightly different key. We turned her every couple of hours in the end, though somehow the procedure felt more incessant than that. At times, it felt like a brutal routine to inflict upon someone under your watch. But there was no room for compromise in the instruction we'd been told to follow. Pressure ulcers can be deadly. And to have any chance of preventing them, we had to subject my grandmother to regular, distressing turns, which can't be done fluently due to the effort involved, turns that demolish whatever quantum of peace only morphine could supply her in repose. Before long, the task inevitably acquired a certain regimentality, yet it remained too intimate ever to be entirely functional. Neither did it become any easier in practice. By design, the whole process is rarely seamless. One hasty move can be torturous. Equally, though, overcautiousness carries its own perils, for the temptation to reposition someone in slow motion prolongs the risk of aggravating areas of skin, especially susceptible to bed sores. However tightly we policed our complacency, there was always room for agony. And however inescapable such pain is, we weren't about to absolve ourselves of the additional suffering we alone seemed to be inflicting. If it appeared as though we were destined to fail, this was hardly an acceptable compensation. The constant glare of anticipatory grief leaves the labor of care bleached of self-forgiveness. The house in which my mother had been born, where she now once again lived on account of poverty, not out of choice, became the place where she would see her own mother die. This symmetry was a privilege amid formidable sadness. Most people want to die at home, observes dementia campaigner and novelist Nikki Gerard, yet most die in hospital. And while the majority of terminally ill people want to be with family, too often they're alone with strangers. How fortunate we were to be bucking that trend. It's these emotional contours that are illuminated throughout the recent medical memoirs I consider in this talk. In each case, caregiving offers an occasion for reassessing the cornerstones of humanizing acts of solicitude, namely empathy, attentiveness, kindness, and especially compassion. By anatomizing compassionate care, such writers draw on their own experiences on the medical front line, while affiliating caregiving itself with something akin to close reading. In Dear Life, is that your mic on, Baz?
Sorry?
Is that your mic on?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, cheers, just a minute, Very. In Dear Life, so this is 2020, the palliative care specialist Rachel Clarke tackles the assumption that because care is about attentiveness, it's frequently devalued by medicine's emphasis on the rational or scientific. As we'll see, the apparently intuitive, relational and routine elements of care that ensure it cannot be easily measured do indeed braid with clinical expertise. And I think this kind of syncs with some of the questions that Bas was raising in his very generous introduction. Clarke will be joined in this paper by the nursing activist and UEA professor of health humanities, Christie Watson. Like Clarke, Watson strives to capture the affective essence of a vocation that ultimately, it's not so much about tasks, but about how in every detail a nurse can provide comfort to a family and a patient. Again, expertise is emotional as much as it is clinical in her case. And together, these writer practitioners offer accounts of care relationships that, in Madeline Bunting's phrase, involve knotty issues of dependence, vulnerability, intimacy, risk, resentment, and fulfillment. Both books were published this year, but only Watson's The Courage to Care managed to take in the pandemic. In each case, though, I'm interested less in their timeliness per se than in their reinvestment in a rather ancient and often disputed structure of feeling we call compassion. Watson's subtitle, A Call for Compassion, posits in the imperative mood a sentiment that many medical memoirists today would see as the prerogative of professional care. Hospices, warns Clarke, including some for children, are having to close, a damning example of the way our Conservative government has been abandoning terminally ill patients in their droves in a country that allegedly provides cradle to grave care. Deficits have been made to seem inevitable, nothing to do with political failing, as the callousness of hospice closures blends into a wider system of fiscal prudence. If anything, the pandemic has simply exposed austerity's naturalization, the tragic costs of which can be seen in the appalling effects COVID has had on elderly and disabled communities in residential care. This outrageous funding situation, writes Clarke, is nothing new for palliative medicine. But today it seems all the more outrageous, she insists, by the virtue of the fact that if you were to choose one metric of a civilized society, wouldn't it be the compassion with which we treat each other as we die? Now, what follows, I want to track how these writers dramatize the primacy of compassion in books that solicit the reader's arresting engagement. In this sense, Dear Life and The Courage to Care epitomize the impulses of what I call in my larger project, sentimental activism. Now, the sentimental activist is a writer unafraid to assume that literature can involve us in moments of intense pathos in ways that trigger not only sympathy, but critical reflection, if not some degree of recognition and action. The sentimental activist is also unafraid to suggest that there are subjects and values for emotive treatment that we universally share, however controversial this feels from the perspective of literary studies, where we're taught to view any sort of generality with some suspicion. Reaching from specific instance to general provocation, from personal experience to conditions of vulnerability that we might all at some point share, is precisely what these books are about. Moreover, in richly describing moments of compassionate care within clinical settings, Watson and Clarke suggest that we need a better understanding of how medicine might sync care's emotional and institutional coordinates. In so doing, they draw attention at the level of representation to the affecting vitality of the moment itself, as we'll see later on. The concentration on deeply affecting moments seems to counterpoint the long-standing prominence that narrative has enjoyed in medical humanities research on illness and patienthood. And particularly, I'm thinking here of the sort of the first wave, what's now called the first wave in health humanities of narrative medicine that Rita Sharon pioneered in the early 2000s. And over the course of this paper, I'll take some time to sort of close read the choreography of such moments, which offer an alternative to the dominance of narrativity as the favoured mechanism by which experiences of illness or care are expressed. Indeed, both Clarke and Watson movingly evoke moments of giving and receiving compassion to elaborate what Angela Woods calls the very diversity of perspectives and forms of self-expression. It has long been the task of the humanities and social sciences to argue are vital in the context of medicine and healthcare. Structured around such moments, Clarke's Dear Life centres on the remarkable work of hospice staff who ensure that people who don't spend their final hours at home are at least surrounded by dignity, calm, even consolation. Yet Clarke's vision of care is unconfined to specialist practitioners. Instead, she reads distinct end-of-life experiences in medical settings for what they reveal about our common sentiments toward illness and dying, sentiments that imbue countless apparently unexceptional procedures and routines of care that take place outside clinical environments too. And one such procedure is the turn, whose shared challenges and inevitable distresses I recounted at the outset. Monotonous, exacting, often undertaken by family members who've had to learn fast the basics of round-the-clock care. The activity of repositioning for the prevention of decubitus ulcers doesn't get much literary airtime. But it does feature in Dear Life feels all the more significant to me, not simply because of Clarke's description facilitates a personal and poignant recognition or connection, reminding me of the strenuous demands of a somewhat taken for granted procedure, but also because it exemplifies Clarke's effort to advance a form of writing that complements one key ambition, what has become to be called the critical medical humanities in recent years, which is this, to broaden the sights and scales of the medical beyond the primal scene of the clinical encounter. While advocating the ways in which doctors might become more emotionally attuned to those other sights and scales within which end-of-life medicine might be practiced, Dear Life also points to the broader reality that it may be easier to look away from palliative care than to face it. Before I move on, I'm going to actually silence my computer in order to silence my emails coming in, if that's all right. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'm just turning off the sound. Okay. Thanks.
We can, yeah.
Great. I'll turn the sound back on when I finish. Apologies. In compelling us to look closer, Dear Life focuses with passionate exactitude on some of society's most vulnerable. Clarke combines institutional advocacy with a memoir of her chosen journey into palliative medicine, where she discovers the profound costs and rewards of providing often excruciating care to strangers. Released just before the COVID-19 outbreak started to escalate, the book retrieves the social variety of hospice communities from the homogenizing statistics into which they are too often subsumed, cordoned off as the high mortality segment of the general population in the epidemic's tragic grasp. And with this particularism, as one might call it, this is one of Clarke's standout strengths as a writer. With it, she documents the specificity of conditions that breach the threshold of medical rescue, where the devastation of imminent loss is unique for each patient and for each relative. One of the challenges she sets herself is how to make those singular spaces of dying legible, while also provoking us to think about the attitudes we share and might need to re-examine about what it means to live fully with a terminal condition. For the most part, Clarke greets that challenge with a sort of tenacious modesty, deflecting the stylistic acrobatics that tend to engage literary scholars. And the apparent simplicity of both books, actually, in this paper is something I'll return to later, and perhaps we can discuss it in the talk after, in the Q&A afterwards. As such, Dear Life apparently foils the pursuit of ambiguity, the enticements of irony, the unraveling of internal contradiction, all those things that normally get our juices flowing in literary studies. Yet given the ethical stakes of Clarke's project, there's reason to celebrate its unassuming syntax, which trains the reader's attention through its lack of ostensible charisma on how care in extremis can otherwise be known and practiced. Indeed, confronting the limits of your critical desire for technical complexity in this book comes to feel, by the end, like a precondition for imagining the very limits of your desire for continued life. Clarke braids the story of why she made her professional switch to palliative medicine with the loss of her father, himself a GP, to cancer. With a dying parent at its fulcrum, Dear Life aligns with Nikki Gerard's and Christie Watson's own care advocacy memoirs. Each integrates devastating familial loss into viscerally compelling accounts of patients' life-threatening or life-extinguishing conditions. Each provides testimonies to the strain and possibilities of caregiving against the backdrop of a fragile medical system in Britain that remains under-resourced after more than a decade of austerity. But what also unites these generic hybrids of activism and autobiography is the ambition to reach beyond the impersonal discourse in which their authors have been trained. In its place, they hone what they consider to be an empathic, relational vocabulary of patient-carer interaction. In Dear Life, this leads to an insistence on what Clarke calls the role of creative compassion in medical care. The clinical encounter ought to be reoriented, in her view, around the act of listening to and respecting other people's stories. In a way, nothing could be more unfashionable from the perspective of literary and cultural studies, where we've been taught by affect theory to be wary, as Anne Jurasek points out, of fellow feeling associated with social notions, such as empathy, sympathy, compassion, and pity. And I think what's useful about Clarke's book is the way it invites us to question whether criticism itself relies on a generalizing view of compassion's deficits and distortions, and asks us to rethink our typically suspicious stance toward identification. Doing so, Dear Life invites us to recognize modes of relation like empathy and compassion as multidimensional, in Jurasek's phrase, as flawed, fascinating, and inescapably at the heart of social relationships. In the end, what I hope to gesture towards the way compassion's contestability and promise in the context of medical narrative compels us to reassess literary studies' own assumptions about the politics of sentimental writing. Now, Clarke didn't plan a career in palliative care. She started out on the front lines of A&E, where she noticed how any capacity for what she calls paying close attention to patients' own experiences of illness and treatment soon dwindled. After only a few years in the profession, she found herself surrounded by doctors and nurses who had barricaded themselves away from the human beings they tended, this is her phrase, becoming hardened and withdrawn simply to survive. Before her own desensitization could take hold, she made an institutional shift. I want to retain my kindness, my impulse to care, not have it bludgeoned down to me, she says. But with that resolve, she discovered a calling. Moving into palliative medicine, she found herself gravitating towards difficult conversations that some of her colleagues would go any lengths to avoid. Dear Life holds that difficult conversation with its reader in an attempt to dispel the usual catalogue of horrors that surrounds terminal illness. Clarke is determined to replenish the language used to contemplate the enormity of being a living creature, as she puts it, who is destined from the outset to die. To confront the sorrowful reality that nothing endures, she argues, is to recognize precisely why human connections are the vital medicine. And in the context of palliative care, there is nothing more powerful than other human presence, she says, surpassing the capacity of medicine's touch. Only love and tenderness, she contends, can alleviate the pang and throb of leaving all you hold dear, of being severed from the world you love so ferociously. As the lilt and lyricism of this last sentence exemplifies, Clarke strives to adjust the very register in which medical encounters are described, reaching beyond the dispassionate vernaculars of inspection, diagnosis, and intervention. Dear Life defies the tendency to biomedicalize patients, as Rebecca Gardner's called it, by replacing narrow representations of pre-selected conditions with detailed portraits of the intersubjective nature of illness. Maintaining the precision of such portraits becomes in itself an ethical proviso for attending to the experience of the individual who suffers. But creating a space for this type of care, argues Clarke, means imagining hospice environments that can topple, she says, conventional medical paradigms. What might such a setting look like? Well, it might be a hospice where aesthetics mattered, speculates Clarke, and her indignation as to why this isn't already the norm is tangible in the following quote. Why can't a wife curl up in a hospital bed beside a dying husband? Why can't we ensure there's a way for an inpatient who knows their precious time is short to have sex with their partner should they choose to? Why aren't we throwing open our doors to teenage children bearing boxes of pizza for movie nights with dad before they lose him forever? More than a set of blueprints for policy amendment, these questions are miniature exhortations that capture the way intimacy might otherwise be facilitated in the face of oblivion. No less moving for being hypothetical, they're snapshots from a truly patient-centered hospital environment, in her phrase, each telling their own micro-story of how solace, as she says, could still thrive in an institution where distress and anxiety are rife. Alternative stories of this kind matter to Clarke, stories that are of unique importance for medical practitioners who wish to reconfigure their practice of care within and despite the dehumanizing space of what Clarke calls the typical busy teaching hospital. Clarke would concur with Nikki Gerard that despite being places of healing and rescue, there's inevitable social isolation that's dangerous for a person whose grip on the world is already fragile. To envision care practices that could mitigate that isolation, Dear Life privileges physician-patient encounters that require doctors to suspend their procedural conventions and listen in. For all the high-tech wizardry of modern medicine, says Clarke, the scans, the genomics, the molecular analyses, it is still the case that invariably, simply by paying close attention to what a patient is telling us, the doctor can work out their diagnosis. Storytelling, a patient describing to their doctor their own illness narrative, is then the bedrock of good medical practice. It's also the bedrock, as I've implied, of the field called narrative medicine, with its recognition of attention in Rita Sharon's account as a requirement for empathic and effective care of one person by another. Dear Life models this capacity through close listening to imagine the situations of others as a prelude to acting on their behalf. Clarke prioritizes patient stories over clinical decisions and actions. The spoken word, she says, I have come to realize, could be as delicate and important as any physical intervention, and sometimes equally life-changing. Words are a means through which doctors build trust, assuage fears, signal compassion, resolve confusion, instill hope, and on occasion, remove it. But they cannot be rushed. Above all, when your focus is people, not body parts, taking time to listen to your patient's words, seeking truly to understand what matters to them, can have astonishing potency. The final noun here crops up again, but this time as a warning rather than a celebration of narratives that surround the once-in-a-lifetime experience of terminal illness. In palliative medicine, she says, perhaps more than any other speciality, the stories we tell ourselves have devastating potency. In a sense, Dear Life is Clarke's attempt to rebalance these potencies so that the fear-thriving space of the unknown, where the moment of extinction lurks, isn't narrated solely in terms of devastation and terror. Countering patients' existential anguish at their own extermination, she says, requires close reading the dark stories we may conjure about our end. We must acknowledge, she insists, that narratives themselves help to construct the endings we fear. So to permit another less dread-laced language of dying to emerge, She rewrites spaces of palliative care against the grain. An establishment that crackles with life, she says. The hospice offers patients the opportunity to forge intense friendships, supporting and encouraging each other. Their mutual respect and solidarity prove that a terminal diagnosis is not a sentence, but the beginning of a process that may take years to unfold, containing love, hope, generosity, and kindness, alongside the inevitable sorrow and loss, all of which constitutes the urgent business, she says, of being human. This might strike readers as almost unpalatably uplifting in some senses, and Clarke makes no attempt to hide what a connoisseur she is of heartwarming catalogues of benevolence in abundance. All that is good, she assures us, in human nature, courage, compassion, our capacity to love, is here in its most distilled form in the hospice. Indeed, time and again, dear life, such litanies of loving kindness counterweigh the awful apprehension of self-loss, yet without superficially veiling its proximity. Far from functional, these lists enumerate what it feels like to witness people rising to their best upon facing the worst. Now, to be sure, trim lines like this sail pretty close to aphorism, I think. The symmetry here between rising and facing is rather sprucely answered by the half rhyme of best, worst. Yet the epigrammatic neatness of those parallel clauses epitomizes the corrective agility of Clarke's style as she crisply dismantles assumptions about hospices as crucibles of overwhelming despair. Quote, there's always a spark of beauty or significance to be found in the life you have left, she advises, even, perhaps especially, at its end. Indeed, if the desolation of lives cut short and loved ones left behind runs throughout dear life, in each chapter, this common thread is punctuated by purposely resonant moments, Clarke's favoured narrative unit of pause, in which peace and perceptual intensity synthesize in brief episodes of alleviation. There's Adele, for instance, who has just a few weeks left to live. She sits exultant in the sunlit hospice garden, quote, being replenished by nothing so technical as honeysuckle bees and a blue vault of sky. There's Teresa, succumbing to systemic sclerosis after years of immunosuppressants, who writes poetry for the first time since childhood, and this quote's on the slide. Inspired by everyday moments she loved, watching a robin eating worms on the lawn outside her kitchen, sitting in the sunshine with her grandson in his ball, she found herself preserving the flow of her life in pages of verse. There's Diane, who learns at 51 that her breast cancer will run its course unimpeded by medicine, and therefore that this will be her last summer. She becomes transfixed by birdsong coming through the open window of her hospice room. The experience prompts her to compose with a music therapist her own song, one that in her words allayed the fear that everyone was going to disappear and be lost forever. There's Ellie, in her early 20s with metastatic breast cancer, who's fading fast and who has her heart set on marrying her fiancé James, while she still can utter the vows. For the ceremony, she summons up every last scrap of energy. No longer a dying woman, we're told, but a bride on her wedding day, radiant, ecstatic. And of course, there's Clarke herself, who's drawn to ponder her father's equanimity as she and her mother care for him at home. A salve for her grief comes in the form of Oliver Sacks' posthumous book, Gratitude, whose title pinpoints an attitude her father shares with the dying, in dying with a sense of a life lived well, filled with patience about whom he cared so deeply. I can see, attests Clarke, how much this helps his departure. Now, scholars in the medical humanities have warned that while narrative and the wealth of possible forms of storytelling brought under its elusive sign can certainly be a vehicle for foregrounding those qualities of personhood, so often thought to be excluded from the narrow biomedical approach to medicine and disease. Nonetheless, it's by no means the only one. And in the captions I've just quoted, Clarke seems to be reinforcing precisely this point. These moments are snapshots, not sequential linear records of experience that end in resolution. Their effective significance as examples of patients thwarting the horror of dying indeed cannot be grasped in narrative terms. In their crystalline poignancy, Clarke's moments become integral to sustaining a thoroughly patient-centered way of writing about compassion as a collective process rather than a personal virtue, an institutionally dependent event rather than a subjective capacity that only a few can cultivate. Now, this aesthetic, I think, is also integral to Christie Watson's most recent book, too. When we talk of compassion, observes Watson, suffering is never very far away, as the origin of the word attests. Latin compassion means suffering with. The pandemic, she says, has been an era in which we've seen much compassion, both from individuals and communities, in words as in life, Darkness and light can and do coexist. Compassion, she concludes, is the only thing that will matter to us in the end. Watson was editing the manuscript for The Courage to Care when the COVID crisis began to escalate, and the book culminates in her decision to return from working as a full-time writer to rejoin her former medical colleagues amid the first peak of the pandemic. A post-Brexit Britain, not only in the grip of a virus, but also by social conflict, suspicion, and mutual resentment also looms large. And The Courage to Care, which I'll hereafter abbreviate as Courage, tracks the implications for the nursing profession of, quote, living in a time of ever-increasing division and hatred and political turmoil. Against this backdrop, Watson orbits a kernel of compassion she locates at the heart of what frontline staff do as they practice care in spaces where sometimes there's no right or wrong, only an in-between. In these spaces, we begin to question our humanity, she says, our vulnerability, even our mortality. This combination of self-scrutiny and humility suffuses the book's reconstructions of tragedy and recovery in scenes of illness and injury. Often medicine and nursing are choices between bad or worse, not good or better. The only way I can cope with this is to think always of compassion, ask myself difficult questions and keep the patient and their family at the heart of all things, to treat them as if they were my own loved ones. I always assumed nursing was about saving lives, that patients want that at all costs, or at least families do. I was wrong. Compassion is the only thing that matters most to patients and their families: dignity, respect, and compassionate care. Now, Watson isn't pious, I don't think, lionizing the sanctity of care. Instead, through awe-infused depictions of nurses at work, she solicits something akin to the admiration, wonder, and respectfulness she hopes to sustain in daily encounters with families' devastations and patients' bravery. When life gives us the greatest challenges, she inserts, it is in nursing that I find the most answers, the most comfort, the most lessons. While Watson learns from different skill set, beyond her own specialization in pediatrics, she discovers that all nurses teach me that whatever nursing you do, the single most important thing is that it is critical to care. To reinforce this point, she offers a long taxonomies of care. In their sheer scale, these catalogues mirror the escalating repertoire of skills and scenarios that nurses have to accommodate. Watson informs us, for instance, that her grandmother's own district nurse treats patients suffering from everything from Crohn's to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and she delivers IV antibiotics, wound care, nebulizers, oxygen, insulin, rapid response, and assessments of serious illness. She administers chemotherapy to cancer patients at home. She provides complex and holistic assessments to prescribe, deliver, and treat people and their families in homes and in nursing homes, homeless centers, refugee clinics, and residential care settings. And crucially, she keeps many people like my nan out of hospital. Watson's recursive verb phrases here, she delivers, she administers, she provides, foreground the breadth of treatments nurses afford across a multitude of care settings, while also announcing the very insufficiency of listing activities in this way. For sure, her catalogue of care situations in and of itself might leave us humbled, but it also reminds us of how much emotionally and physically must lie behind such a functionally recited range of activities, which only intensifies our awe further still. In its grammatical straightforwardness, then, this paratactic rendition of care tasks counterpoints the complexity of what a district nurse accomplishes as a matter of routine. Style itself thus helps to generate the admiration Watson clearly wants us to feel, an admiration she brings close to home in that pithy final clause. There she underscores the heroism of what nurses do every day to elderly folks like her nan, who would otherwise be consigned to hospital wards, which causes the relative impersonality of all those preceding listed clauses to modulate into a candid statement of gratitude. The way Watson utilizes rather than conceals repetition in this book is just one aspect of the simplicity that Courage carries forward from her last book, The Language of Kindness, which in a sense sort of did exactly what it says on the tin. It promoted the language of kindness as something that's at the center of professional care. This simplicity demands attention from the reader who, in the absence of beguiling metaphor, convolution, or obliquity, has literally nowhere else to look. Among Watson's favored tactics of repetition in Courage features the self-reinforcing reiteration of a verb that establishes slight distinctions between observations, whose adjacency then touches off a conclusive insight. For instance, the next quote, "As a nurse, I am learning how powerful it is to save a life, and I'm learning how powerful it is to give meaning to a life. Both actions save lives in the end, but the latter saves many lives all at once." However, for compassion in healthcare to be more than an abstraction, it cannot simply be taxonomized or repeatedly asserted in this way. Watson seems to know this, and in order not only to write about compassion's indispensability, but also to perform some palpable characteristic of that compassion at the level of the writing itself, she recounts a tragic instance of a critically ill baby, Michael, born prematurely to abusive, drug-addicted parents. The mother herself is in critical care following a traumatic brain injury. Watson learns that she had been kicked in the stomach and thrown down the stairs by her partner, Danny. Taking a compassionate view of this horrific context, one that would acknowledge that maybe Danny isn't a monster after all, or that all our lives are shaped by circumstances, suddenly seems impossible. Instead, admits Watson, I feel the color of my blood, violent, angry red. She tries to remedy this outrage by focusing hard on tiny Michael. Her effort to do so is reproduced at the level of language in a frank summary of his condition. Here, the precision of medical terminology does nothing to obstruct the horror of those syndromes she lists. Michael has had the worst start imaginable. Born addicted to crack cocaine and heroin, even in his tiny state, he shows signs of fetal alcohol syndrome, characteristic facial features, and the small head circumference known as microcephaly. Like all babies on NICU, his story started before he did. Some children are born with odds stacked so high against them that it's impossible to comprehend any meaningful recovery. And yet nursing has taught me that recovery is always a possibility. There is always hope. Michael's nurse has been singing to him throughout the night. For Watson, that kind of vigil is a paragon of healthcare. It's these things that nurses do, she notes, which supposedly make no sense, that make the most sense to me. They are explicitly sentimental acts of amelioration, enabling rather than conflicting with expert and evidence-based care. And so, while supporting his organ failure and resuscitating him, Watson's colleague prescribes him songs and nursery rhymes. I wonder if he can hear her, says Watson. I hope so. Watson later has to face the moment she's been dreading when she's greeted with Michael's in Michael's incubation room by his father, handcuffed to a prison officer. Watson prepares herself to expect to hate Danny. After detail she provides of his violence, it's hard for readers not to partake in the repulsion she can't help herself from feeling, despite her professional training in remaining non-judgmental towards abusers. Watson's style of observation compensates for the revulsion she has learned to conceal by keeping a poker face through spare notations of the man's interactions with the son he will soon lose, stroking Michael's head in the softest possible way. Knowing this baby is extremely unlikely to survive, that his mum is deteriorating, that Danny himself will be imprisoned for a long time, all these dire eventualities await a family destroyed before it could really exist. But as a form of redress for that destruction, Watson frames a moment of fleeting contact that will probably be the only time that father and son spend together. Michael can't leave the incubator, but she tries to encourage Danny to touch him anyway. And what ensues is one of those time-stalling moments in Courage, where the register of the writing, sympathetically poised despite Watson's prevailing anger, offers its own aesthetic demonstration of the book's overarching advocacy of compassion. There is a moment between the two of them. Michael is curled into the palm of his dad's hand. The light changes, Danny's eyes change. It's as though we're both born for this one moment. It's maybe these moments that connect us all, these extreme moments of love that shock us out of who we are and remind us of who we could be. The clipped sentences, unspliced by separate clauses except for the parotactic opening one, decelerate the description of this brief tableau of tenderness. Each grammatically simple phrase is itself a kind of moment, equally consequential, each enveloped by the extreme pathos that comes with these micro-episodes of love that announce their own brevity and irrevocability. This is, of course, Danny's moment, ultimately, but as it doesn't stop Watson drawing from the fleeting yet profound transformation it hosts, something emblematic for us all. This most private and tragic of moments makes apparently inconceivable devotion suddenly possible. Watson treats this as a more universal lesson that ought to remind us of who we could be. She thereby presents a distinctly sentimental apotheosis, in which the forgiveness of this deplorable man becomes legible even for Watson by extension for her readers, especially if they've identified with her struggle to conceal her own outrage. As such, the moment here operates on several levels at once, it seems to me, as a name for love in extremis, as a structural device for stillness and intensification, and as an interval for descriptive delicacy dedicated to the barest notations of light, behavior, and inferred connection. It's therefore also a moment that showcases the performativity of Watson's own writing, by which I mean it calls attention to how language enacts the very struggle for and promise of compassion as a shared achievement that she wants to extrapolate from the professional arena of nursing. Let's begin to wrap up. If the medical humanities, as Anne Whitehead suggests, needs a more contextualized and a more politicized sense of the patient-practitioner relation, one that could also usefully extend beyond the clinical to address other medical settings, sites, and domains, then the efforts of writers like Clarke and Watson remain crucial to this need for more diverse narratives of healthcare. What I've learned from engaging with their work is that comparatively conventional modes of representing patient-practitioner relations can upset literary studies' own distinctly conventional preference for formally enigmatic texts that go out their way to avoid the sentimental. I still don't think I've found a satisfactory way to describe their approach, an approach that's stylistically modest, emotionally earnest, expressively audacious only insofar as certain sequences of concision and precision can be made to model as though providing aesthetic counterpoint for compassionate care. But refining this nomenclature seems less important to me than recognizing the affective impact of the simplicity that their writing carries, as they convey not only the intensity of a physician's positive feelings for a patient, in Jodie Halpin's phrase, but the ability of the physician to understand a patient's emotional point of view. Of course, books like Dear Life and Courage to Care aren't simply designed to enrich an academic field of study, but to change public perception. And in the wake of this year's pandemic, they sound not just instructive, but furious. Clarke and Watson both punctuate their scenes of tragedy, bereavement, bravery, and consolation with razor-edge inquisitions into the institutional precarities and social injustices that the pandemic has brought into focus. The government commended the public for helping to prevent the NHS from becoming overwhelmed at COVID's Easter peak. But did it matter, asked Clarke, with unconcealed outrage in a piece for The Guardian this spring, that 400,000 of our most vulnerable citizens were promised shielding while being effectively abandoned in hospices, and that the alleged success of April came at such a stupendous cost to those too elderly, frail, disabled to live in their own homes? The system, of course, was almost primed to guarantee such an outcome. As Madeline Bunting has recently pointed out, the crisis of care has been a long time in the making, and COVID will unleash, she predicts, a huge questioning of the politics and governing systems which failed to foresee this disaster. In the end, so long as industrialized, marketized healthcare prioritizes transactional care with measurable outcomes, it will furnish a system, in Bunting's phrase, that squeezes out compassion. Given this context, the rationale for Clarke's and Watson's varieties of sentimental activism seems pretty clear. As we've seen, Clarke opens wide an affective portal through which our readers can enter richly described realms of letting go, where lives are still amply led. Watson, for her part, celebrates the ward as a place of cooperation, versed in the grammar of kindness, where in moments of emergency, a medical team's skills and experience all come together. In stepping into these realms, though, one starts to wonder what's left for criticism to do. All the usual avenues for intricate analysis seem blocked by Clarke's determination to concentrate on the quieter, smaller things doctors and nurses and carers alike can do to make places of pain more humane, and by Watson's account of collective composure in situations where every minute, as she says, every second counts. For how exactly are we to engage with works like this that offer literary scholars relatively slight opportunities for acrobatic investigation? How might we explain the merit of our stirring encounters with such books, especially when they don't necessarily measure up against criticism's endorsement of the suavely estranging or the impishly perplexing? Perhaps one reason to indeed to admire writers like Clarke and Watson lies precisely in their refusal to play ball with the idealization of formally transgressive or unorthodox texts, the allure of which for critics often boils down to the way they thwart our desire for identification, attachment, or uplift. The kinds of effects, in other words, that critics have long associated with naive or sentimental ways of reading. But here's the thing. If Clarke's and Watson's texts are the polar opposite of avant-garde innovation, that doesn't necessarily make them any easier. Indeed, they're all the more challenging for leaving the critic's appetite for disruption thoroughly unsated. What they showcase in place of formal difficulty or flamboyance is the capacity for approachable books to blunt our most trusted tools of dissection. And they do this by compelling us to look again at the emotive observations of caregiving, excruciatingly inspiring in an equal measure, whose sympathy-inducing force is usually what gets the agonistic reader's antenna quivering. Contrary to theorists like Lauren Ballant, who claims that sentimental writing allows us to talk about the emotional costs of injustice at the expense of material ones, Clarke and Watson scrutinize the felt experience of caregiving in ways that also scrutinize its institutional realities. The very real costs of sustaining compassion are integral to their portraits of a system whose material fragility we can no longer afford to overlook. For this increasingly urgent genre of life writing, emotional candor and linguistic transparency acquire political traction. Maybe literary criticism then has something to learn after all from the sentiments of such books, whose pathos might seem too uncomplicated to warrant much analysis. Maybe the self-satisfaction of distancing ourselves from the solicitations of such works is the very thing they oblige us to give up. The temperate artistry of these texts, then, I'd argue, alters the disposition with which we greet them. Clarke and Watson summon us without piety to share their first-hand experience of environments of care that society rarely wishes to think about until the time comes. Chronically underfunded environments that may be synonymous with illness and dying, which are, as Clarke puts it, remarkably full of life. Where there is more of what matters, she says, more love, more strength, more kindness, more smiles, more dignity, more joy, more tenderness, more grace, more compassion than you could ever imagine. I could say something about the risks Clarke's repeated determiner, more, runs in here and tipping this inventory of virtues toward the sentimental. But that would feel like overstepping the remit of close reading books about close reading care, or misconstruing their prompt to feel something other than an urge to prosecute the pathos they conjure without apology. When, in short, is enough enough, asks Clarke. That's the question some patients have to ask themselves when treatment options are exhausted, one that my Nan had little time to entertain before a series of strokes eroded her ability to say much at all. It's also the question that haunts critical practice, I think, which is made conscious of its overreach when turning to works of life writing like these. Such is the signal achievement of books whose emotional lineaments prompt readers to reflect on what exactly they're looking for when reading narratives that both model compassion while encouraging us to wonder how we make sense of care alongside the limits of repair. Without so much as a whiff of mortality tourism, Clarke and Watson ask us to fathom, more frankly than most of us are probably inclined to do, how life might otherwise be lived if we were ever to get that chance to decide when enough is indeed enough. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was really wonderful, rich, with full of ideas, and I'm sure that we all have made connections in our heads. And can I ask the attendees to put their questions in the Q&A box, please? We kept the Q&A box closed off to not disturb David whilst delivering his paper. So whilst you do that, let me maybe start off with a question, David. And I mean, there's so many things to say here, and we, as kind of literary scholars, kind of draw on our wealth of our own kind of literary history. And you may think of W.H. Auden, Musée des Beaux-Arts, and suffering, and there's of course a whole history of thinking about mortality and suffering. But there seems to be maybe a gap here that you kind of really pinpoint, where the limits of the literary critic are kind of halted in a way. So we can explore that, but before we do that, one of the things I was thinking about, have you looked at gender at all? Have you looked at the way in which men and women approach suffering, empathy, compassion, those topics in a different way? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, definitely. I mean, clearly there's a gender element to care, given the gender inequalities and where in terms of where the labour of care falls. I mean, and Madeline Bunting's book, which is just out, called The Labour of Care, the Labours of Love, sorry, which is all about the crisis of care. starts from that premise, that actually there are enormous and life-changing inequalities in terms of how the care is practiced. But in terms of writing, that is an interesting question. I mean, that there are as many doctors as there are nurses writing these kinds of books, the Atul Gawande being, probably the most prominent US, or being mortal, but I think what's significant about, particularly Christie Watson's work is that nursing remarkably is still an underappreciated, undervalued, underrewarded, underpaid profession, right? And particularly in her first book, it's just you are just shocked by the way she's on the poverty line for a large chunk of her career, and progression is really shallow, and that's not so much necessarily about gender, but it's certainly our perception of nursing certainly is riven with gender inequality, and is only exacerbated by the profession itself. And most of her colleagues are women, to put it frankly, and juggling multiple responsibilities, systemic underinvestment, after training for years, and then working long hours. So it's truly remarkable that we have the situation at all, actually. And I think that's where, of course, the activism part, the consciousness raising element of the book is so vividly apparent.
Absolutely. So how do you kind of explain the current popularity of these types of narratives? One of the things, it seems to be a boom, like maybe, I don't know, 10 to 5 years ago, you had the brain memoir. So the idea of people who had suffered brain trauma, we're writing about this. And so, but there seems to be a surge in this type of writing.
Yeah.
Why is this happening? I mean, surely you could be cynical. It's a marketing thing, and publishers are latching onto this. But is it maybe something to do with our awareness of what's happening in the public realm?
I think so. I mean, I think we're having generally a memoir boom anyway. I mean, I sort of partly explored this in my last book on consolation, which was taken up, so much of it was taken up with life writing. And of course, grief memoir itself is not a new genre at all, but that there is no mistaking the fact that if you do empirical work, you see that the genre is flourishing, since the 1990s, certainly. And for life writing in general, I think you can quite confidently say that, we're in a remarkable moment for life writing, whether you're talking about landscape writing, Helen Macdonald, but also employment writing. People want to hear about the writing of work, of which these memoirs are part. So while pathography isn't new, I mean, the writing about illness, the writing of one's own illness, you go back to Audre Lorde, right? I mean, or Susan Sontag, that is not necessarily a new genre, but I see this as a kind of subgenre within the larger genre of pathography or illness,
sure. Yeah.
Which does seem to be new. The practitioner writer work, which is trying to do something more than simply reporting on professional experience. It actually is doing something at the level of the writing, which is significant in itself. And that's where that's what fascinates me, is what these aren't simply journalistic kind of or factual records. These are deeply emotive. They want to solicit a kind of deep engagement from the reader that is almost novelistic in a way.
Interesting, yeah.
And that moves between the confessional and the observational and the activists in very fluent ways, and that are very beautifully written, earnestly written, but stylistically very beautiful too. If also quite simple, like, as I said, I mean, I think that's what I found difficult, is actually dealing with their simplicity. Dealing with the actual, the grammatical, literally the grammatical sentence by sentence sort of traction that they have upon you, which is incredibly emotive. And then you stop and you stand back and think, what exactly is what is happening to me when I'm reading this, and why does it feel so uncomfortable from the point of view of, from a critic who is always trained to read against the grain, to read beyond the surface, and it'd be wrong to suggest, they only demand surface reading. I'm not a surface reader in that sort of Sharon Marcus Stephen Best way, but I do feel like that they do solicit from you a kind of condition of what Sharon Marcus would call, and I think quite fruitfully, is just reading, which she calls in her book, where you're allowing the work to have some kind of rippling effect upon you, and yet you are actually noticing its operations for what they are. That idea of, that's what fascinates. There's actually something quite complex, it seems, going on there, beyond their apparent sort of stylistic straightforwardness. That actually there's something quite complicated in terms of its solicitation of just reading these events, which should inspire awe and humility, really.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was thinking of my question about why it's so popular. Maybe it has to do something with the digital technology that surrounds us all the time, and a sense of reality hunger that we want, at least a sense of a memoir that gives us some kind of reality and immerse ourselves into that. But we'll come back to that. So we've got some questions from the panel. So if you open your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, maybe we can go through these. So
I should get the Q&A.
Yeah.
Wrong.
So Liz Berry talks about going to a panel at the MLA on empathy a few years ago.
Liz, okay, yeah.
Is there a danger that in reading about and feeling empathy through reading, we feel we've already done our bit, tick that box?
Is there a danger in that about feeling empathy through reading, and tick that box? Absolutely, and I think yes, that's but I'm by no means sort of defending empathy as a kind of in a sort of Martha Nussbaumian sense that that literature provides a kind of education, empathy, or a kind of emotional education, right? And there are power dynamics always built into empathy, particularly. But it seems to me one of a productive way of thinking. I mean, I think that an empathy in our current moment is ferociously difficult, I think, to engage with in terms of empathizing across cultural difference, right? Which always involves a power relation. But I suppose what we need to distinguish what empathy means in the world, as a kind of virtue, which gets thrown about, and the way in which literature might engage both with its contestability and its promise, insofar as literature can stage moments of empathic relation that are really about the problem of recognizing difference and recognizing one's power differential within the act of empathy, within the experience or the event of empathy, right? And I think that's what literature can do as a medium that other forms of representation can't, or other accounts of empathy can't, right? Yeah, so I mean, I think we need to get. I think I'm persuaded to move beyond this, the dismissal of empathy by critics who see it as purely about a vicarious, almost like touristic entrance into the lives of others, in a way that allows you to feel deeply self-satisfied, right? Or that it's purely evasive. Invasive. I mean, I think Jen Cook has a very compelling article called "The Violations of Empathy," which I think actually sums that up. I mean, it's very tight. Empathy is a violation, right? It's an ethical violation, really. And yes, indeed, it can be. The problem, the question that the writers themselves raise for me is then why are they promoting it so much? I mean, you have a writer who is a practicing nurse or a doctor who says, empathy is absolutely the center of what we do. And then she writes about it in a way that models a form of empathic connection. And what interests me as a literary critic is how I reconcile then the training we have to be very cautious about empathy, with the kind of, bold assertion of empathy's importance in clinical practice, for instance, right? And it might not just be in nursing memoir, it might be in refugee writing too. And I'm working with Valeria Lucelli, who also talked about the problems, but also the possibilities of empathy, right? And again, that's another area in which empathy becomes incredibly controversial, but nonetheless, as a novelist, she believes that it's something worth hanging on to and cultivating. So, so I think we're at that moment, where we have a sort of almost a schism between the kind of critical discussions we have about these kind of social emotions, as Laura Blount would call them, and what writers themselves feel that's worth investing in and affectively communicating. But it's a great question, and I think it's I mean, I suppose my going back to my work in constellation, I'm more interested in really literature, not to find literary proof that empathy is possible or constellation is good, but actually that literature provides or stimulates and mediates a kind of argument with those very affects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in literature, we're quite used to writers withdrawing or withholding affect, right? So from Ishiguro, but also like I guess Louis Theroux is very good at sort of not judging, and we bring emotions and affect, and once it's already on the page, this is what kind of what Liz is also meaning, I think. But absolutely. So let's go to.
Chris,
But Chris, please. Yeah, I've got some requests for people who want to basically to be unmuted. So I'm trying to see if that's possible.
Yeah.
But
sorry, where's the thing on? I've lost it now. Right, there we are. Yeah.
Q&A. So can you tease out the relationships in these texts between a narrative rooted in the author's experience and narrative that relays another person's experience, rather finding dialogues between authorial and other voices in the novel? What is the authority of clinical observation? Whose compassion for whom?
Well, observation, I think, is clearly key there. I think what all these works are doing, and I can only quote so much from them. You feel like to sort of set a reading list before, because the scenes are quite long. These sort of concentrational moments, as I sort of tried to suggest. The aspiration is to shift from a kind of clinical, objectifying, biomedical form of observation to something like an emotional and compassionate form of observation, in which eventually the patient is the center, or if you say the driving agent of the story, so to speak. And it's a great question, actually, because it is so much of these books are about, in a sense, are about these writers just recounting moments of kind of tragedy or uplift or reprieve or sorrow or hope, but very much rooted through the patient's experiences. Each episode is structured around a case, an instance, devastating or uplifting. And so there's definitely a sense of authority trying to be relinquished. These are by no means straightforward autobiographies. In fact, you actually rarely get, proportionally in the narrative, there is rarely a kind of straightforward sense in which, or the straightforward moments of autobiographical recollection. It's very much the patient's voice is being kind of is leading the narrative in that sense. Which if you compare, I mean, interesting there, you sort of say how does that might relate to the novel, which is interesting. So I think there is something, that's why there's always something novelistic, as kind of flaccid as that term is, but about the relinquishing of the I, or the dissolution of the I in these texts, whereby it almost slips into something like free and direct discourse, whereby the patient's perspective is observed, not assumed or invaded necessarily, but nonetheless observed. So there's a kind of relinquishing of that authority of the autobiographical I, and giving it over to something like what Watson has, Clarke calls a sort of patient-centered aesthetic, which is certainly the aspiration of a lot of critical medical humanities discourse now. Whereby clinical observation needs to be also always qualified by the experience of the person who suffers. But these are necessarily relaying and mediating the devastation of others, and so it does bring up that ancient ethical problem of representing the sorrow of another person, which again is what distinguishes this from, say, straightforward first person pathographies where you're writing about your own illness. Which say Anne Boyer's account of her recent cancer memoir, The Undying, would be the classic example there. Yeah.
I mean, we can maybe move to Sean Matthews, who's kind of his question is bouncing off of that. So, David, you're concerned with the lines between novelistic, i.e., fiction, and testimony, memoir, and documentary aspects, the type of reading critique that they demand. You've obviously worked on this in relation to fiction. How far does the literary text provide a form for this writing? Does your empirical work show connections of determination? So I guess what Sean wants to say is, as a literary critic, we've been trained in analysing particular discourses, and we've got all these frameworks, narratological frameworks and poetic frameworks. And how does that work in relationship to understanding those more memoir type, testimony type, documentary novels or fiction, non-fictions, I guess, right? So.
Yeah, right. I mean, I suppose, how far does genre determine response? I guess it's a great question, Sean. Particularly when our whole critical vocabulary is trained in a kind of, still sort of pseudo forensic or at least methodical way of unpicking something against the grain. Perhaps how we don't need to be Frederick Jameson to read the unconscious something. But sort of it's ingrained in our vocabulary in a sense. So and that's sort of what I try to gesture toward the end is what in feeling humbled and feeling these like strange, which I think are slightly odd, and immediate and visceral affective responses to these works, which are also politically urgent and timely in the moment that we're living through. Where does that leave the tools of analysis beyond what could be dismissed as sort of pure appreciation? And Sean's just qualifying. He said, what I'm trying to say is that do the formal generic aspects you identify in the writing about affective fiction show that the memoirs draw on these models?
And maybe just before that, he invokes Foucault as well. So
right.
Foucault being a fiction writer, obviously, right?
Yeah, way of get beyond the parallel. Yes, that's right. Discourse of clinic, but there's a way of getting beyond the parallel. Yes. Where there's formal and generic aspects identifying the writing about the memoirs draw on those models. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure they draw consciously on models provided by fiction, but they certainly provide a reading experience that is analogous to reading fiction, albeit with the added stakes that what you're doing is you're reading about a profession which, for many of us, is kind of awe-inspiring, right? I mean, that's kind of the crucial difference to me. I mean, I can it's not that fiction doesn't do this too. I mean, there are forms of autofiction now that are similarly arresting, but they're still written from the position of distance observation in a sense. But what you're getting kind of is there's a difference when you're reading a first-hand portrait of a profession for which, and I think this is only going to become more apparent, for which we should feel utter gratitude, right? And what interests me is what we do with that gratitude in terms of critical practice. Gratitude is not something we ever come to a novel. I'm so grateful that I read The Line of Beauty or something, and maybe or that maybe you would, but I like it too. I like Hollinghurst too, but there's a sense a few months after we stood outside our doors clapping for key workers in the NHS, and then we have a body of work which is a kind of testimony to that gratitude and admiration. There's a kind of historical particularity to these works in the context we're living through that alters what I call the sort of critical disposition that they both elicit or solicit, and demand.
Well, maybe it's also to do with the changing trajectory of the novel from the 19th century realism, where the novel was kind of capturing society and delving into a particular kind of organic form of society, which the modern novel does to an extent, maybe not so much anymore. And there's a different way of approaching society for sure. And maybe that's why these novels that delve deeply into individual suffering, but also collective suffering that is embodied by a hospital, etc. So maybe that's what it brings back to us. Maybe that's what it does. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Lena.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Lena. What about the role of text non-fictionality and its significance? Do you want to read this out?
Yeah, so Lena, who's in Germany. Hi, Lena. Good to see you. Well, to read you. I was wondering about the role of the text non-fictionality and its significance for the reader's emotional response. You have emphasized their accessibility and simplicity, the fact that it can just be read. Our account, like Watson's and Clarke's, more conducive to evoking compassion than fictional narratives per se. So.
Yeah, I mean they yeah. I mean, I think they're less good at is actually problematizing compassion. I would say, you know, if I was going to state my, you know, if I was good, but yeah, I would say that, you know, I've been reading compassion in writers like Zadie Smith, for instance, and Valerie Lucelli, whose work seems to me to be deeply concerned with sort of like both staging but also scrutinizing compassion at the same time. And it's that out of that kind of dialectic of staging and scrutinizing do you get a much more uncomfortable portrait of compassion's limits. And particularly in the work of say Zadie Smith, it seems, and Lucelli too, I think, is that they're preempting the self-satisfaction that we critics might have in dismissing compassion or in dismissing sympathy, right? I mean, I think there's that's what I find problematic about a sort of Ballantian approach, Laurent Ballant's approach to compassion and sympathy is the confidence with which we can generalize about a text production of compassion and its limits, as though we, in our intellectual superiority, know what the general reader would do with the compassion that a text solicits from them. And I think there's something really problematic about that, because any account of sentiment relies upon a susceptible reader that you can point to in your account of sentimentalism's drawbacks, right? So, and empirically, it's very hard to justify that. But anyway, I'm more interested in the ways in which texts sort of stage their own problematic engagement with ubiquitous but nonetheless contestable sentiments like compassion and empathy. But what you don't get in the medical memoirs that we're engaged with today, I think, is that kind of critical engagement, and that's what's actually quite difficult. You know, it's the way in which they so earnestly invest in models of affective relation that makes it hard for us, actually, paradoxically, to engage with them critically. And because they are when you're in the moment. I mean, reading The Language of Kindness, which is Watson's first book, you know, is heart-stopping, and particularly if you have kids, because she's in pediatrics. So every scene is literally gut-wrenching, right? And it's difficult to actually get a kind of critical perspective on a book like that, which is so insistently demanding that there is a particular kind of emotional reaction to this that is warranted, right? And so in answer to Lee, that's a very long and convoluted way of answering Lee's question, which is a very good question. But it's one that I'm tussling with now. Is what does fiction do that memoir can't do? You know, and I think it's that kind of once that sort of the way in which fiction can turn into an argument its own affective economy. You know, it can use its own affective economy to produce a kind of argument with the reader, or to invite a kind of argument with the reader, in a way that these incredibly sort of bold and direct memoirs perhaps don't do. You know, I don't know if that answers your question, Lena.
For me, it was also about the per se that she put in the final line. So, of course, we're on a sliding scale, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
The architecture of a novel as a
Yeah.
form of art is different from the memoir per se. So I think
Yeah.
there is something right there. And it's not just about the content, it's about the structures that are being built in our head when we read those novels. And when you read Henry Marsh, his kind of adventures as a neuroscientist, yeah, it is relatively straightforward in a way. It is, like you were saying, scene and then a scene, etc. It's a completely different architecture of the imagination, I would say.
And that's, I mean, and also gestures of, I mean, I think there's, you know, we have something that sits in between memoir fiction, of course, is the autofiction, which is full of self-implication. So there you're getting a kind of tacitly self-implicating narrative perspective, which may or may not be the author itself, him or herself. And so the kind of self-scrutiny becomes all the more apparent, or the in works that sort of sit somewhere between straightforward memoir and right.
Absolutely. Let's go to, we may come back to Chris, responding to the earlier question, but I want to move on to Max. Max is one of my PhD students. Thank you for your talk. Atul Gawande talks in Being Mortal about American medicine being too obsessed with beating a disease against all odds instead of having realistic and compassionate conversations with likely terminal patients about death and the quality of life that is left. Regarding stories and storytelling, do you think the Hollywood formula of the hero overcoming peril against all odds has been a reason for this skewed perspective? So it's whether other paradigms that we're very much familiar with in the 21st century have determined how we are thinking about patients and care, and how do you bring ambiguity to this effective way of storytelling these against all the odd stories we so like to hear, watch and read?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think Dear Life, great question, Max. Yeah, I think and again, I think the sliding scale of genre, which Bas talked about, is useful to think about here. But I think, you know, Dear Life is precisely about that. Is pushing back against the narrative of overcoming and fear, the sort of the strangely entwined narrative of the fear of death that is then entwined with the only possibility of the only way we can reconcile ourselves with it is by overcoming that, you know. Or illness is again, you know, that the illness narratives must always be about overcoming and therefore resolution. I mean, certainly Clarke is in her deliberate concentration on what she calls those conversations that even her own medical colleagues would rather not have, is trying to figure out ways of writing about dying by putting patients who know they're going to die at the center of the narrative. So giving them the authority, and both as in terms of narrative authority, but also in terms of giving them the authority over their own death. Because so many of those scenes are precisely about that. What she praises about the hospice environment that she works is allowing patients to become the agents of their own death. Whereas we often assume that we're helpless in the face of death, right? It's the one thing that's going to overtake our agency. And so, you know, and the same to a certain extent goes to Christie Watson. You know, she's at the level of narrative, she wants to give the patients the agency to tell their stories of illness, and many of which don't end in resolution, many of which aren't uplifting. But yeah, we have. I mean, Hollywood. Yeah, we can blame Hollywood. You know, there is still a deeply pervasive kind of convention. I worked a little bit on this when I was thinking about consolation a few years ago. You know, it's you know, to what extent is there the reason why criticism has such a hard time with consolation is there's so much consolation in popular culture, right? Not that consolation is bad or that fiction doesn't have complex things to say about it. It's because it's all over the movies, right? I mean, and that narratologically almost that Hollywood operates on a kind of consolation or resolution or redemption or overcoming kind of logic, right? And that's, you know, that's still true. I mean, that may be formally true about it, but I wonder, this is coming back to my sort of beef with Ballant, that I'd be cautious about making assumptions about what then that does to audiences. I'd be cautious about saying, well, simply because the movies are churning this stuff out, that the audiences are therefore pacified by this kind of these narratives of overcoming or redemption. And that's where I think that the case for sort of disruption and avant-garde rebellion and discomfiture and kind of non-linearity and rupture can be overstated, because it's almost like we need that as medicine. Well, I think readers are quite capable of reading a very redemptive narrative, but also questioning it at the same time. And I'm more interested in seeing, in sort of accommodating that, you know, rather than making assumptions about the way in which certain generic operations that we see in popular culture all the time might map onto readly dispositions, which is the sort of standard line about the problems of sentimentalism, right? Is that sentimentalism is a quick fix gratification that pacifies us and therefore leaves us somehow, bludgeoned into kind of a kind of acquiescent sort of disposition, you know. But it's simply not, maybe not the case. That we may well be able to read something which is heartrending and poignant and full of pathos, and also come away enraged and willing to enact some kind of ethical change, right? So, but yeah, there's I hope that goes some way to answer your question there.
I think that's great, David, and I think Max's question is really about sort of whether we as a society and as the medical profession are too goal-driven, and we're not necessarily interested in process and context during a particular kind of medical trial. So I think that is really quite interesting, and that reminds me of what you quoted Watson saying that, and why shouldn't we have like couples where one partner is terminally ill have a need for sex, and maybe if children are involved, can we create a family situation, because that makes the process much more human, I think. So there is a point there, I would think. So I'm just want to go to, we've got an anonymous attendee. So what can lit crits of compassionate medical memoirs contribute to the political agenda of care and compassion, or should we let such texts speak for themselves? So how can, what we do as English literature critics, how can we bring, and I guess through close reading, through analysis, turn these texts into, don't want to say weaponize these texts, but bring it, give it more of a political angle, a social critical kind of angle. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you know, we're here to sort of study the attitudes that otherwise might be taken for granted, right? So, and there is lots of compassion around. It's very difficult to pick up a newspaper now without thinking of compassionate communities and people sewing face masks for each other and that sort of thing, you know. And but we're here to sort of dig deeper, aren't we? I mean, to put it rather kind of crudely, is but yeah, this raises an interesting question that I thought was sort of, I suppose, in the pivot towards the end of my talk about, in a sense, what do we do with these texts from analytical perspective, you know, where on the one hand, at one extreme, you simply let them speak for themselves, or as Sharon Marcus would say, you just read them without sort of with much further explication. You know, you allow them, you elucidate what they're doing, in a sense. Or as Derek Attridge would say, you know, what you're doing is you're giving an account of their singularity, you know, giving the account of what they're doing, how they're performing their own singularity, and how they're enacting their own importance upon you as a reader, right? So that's one way in which we do it. And well, whether literary criticism has a privileged place is a slightly different question, and an interesting one. I've always been quite skeptical about the claims for, or criticism's tendency to arrogate it to itself a kind of social agency that it doesn't necessarily deserve. We've just gone through an incredibly tumultuous decade of methodological conflict, much of which has come out of very elite institutions in the US, of course, but which has taught us actually, and which has been a lot of soul searching really about the role of criticism, and whether we need to look again at the assumptions we make about our claims for critical agency or substantive agency, and about the relationship between scholarship and activism, right? And whether the assumption that they can be one and the same are valid, or what would it mean to bring those two things together? Yeah, I mean, I think, I've always thought that the idea that criticism can substantially intervene in social process, it might itself be a kind of sentimental activism. I mean, I wonder whether that is itself a kind of valid hope, but it is nonetheless a form of, is deeply impassioned and I think, but tacitly self-aggrandizing kind of agenda, right? I mean, and that's fine. I think we need to think about the ways in which we matter to the world. But we're in, I think we're at a very interesting moment in the field right now, where I don't think we'd be having this discussion back in the 80s, for instance. I think because it would be just taken for granted that we do matter. And I think if there is one great kind of upshot of the very difficult process of interdisciplinarity that's happened in the last sort of 20 years, where we have gone and spoken to folks in, medical history, history of science, geography, whatever. It's really thinking about, okay, so what within my disciplinary expertise, not how can my discipline change to matter, but how can we come together with other disciplines in order to produce something that has some kind of substantive effect on things that we think matter, right? And that's true in disciplinary work. It seems to me that's the way in which we don't try to become something else, but we bring our expertise together. And scientists would have been doing this all the time. They wouldn't think there was anything unusual about that. But I think that's perhaps one of the ways in which you might want to think about interdisciplinarity, and convince our managers that that's the way we should think about interdisciplinarity too.
It's interesting.
It's a fascinating question. It's an ongoing debate, I think, methodologically within the field, and people like Robin Weigman in the US, and Stephen Best, of course, and Heather Love have been, written fascinatingly about this. And Heather's work particularly has been trialing, really, in her own sort of words, the adoption of kind of social science methods, more empirical methods, as a way of thinking about the way criticism might operate without that kind of the critic becoming this kind of heroically empathic figure who has a particular kind of cryptographic and politically astute way of explaining the world to other people. Instead, what about using more empirical tools of description and explication?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. But it may not be just literary criticism, close reading that can do that, but there are new methodologies, computational linguistics, who can maybe shed light into one of the first questions I asked about gender, for instance. There's lots of different kind of comparisons that we can make. And well, I think we're going to slowly draw to a close. So Chris Ward has come back with another question, which I think could be a suitable final question. Read criticism again. Can criticism function if you reserve special awe and gratitude for your subject? Need you be any more or less in awe of nurses in general than in novelists in general? So yeah, I think that's a very good question, and one of the things I was thinking about. We can obviously treat these memoirs seriously. A friend of mine in New York has got a course on neurodiversity and the brain memoir. So by investigating those genres, those new genres, they could kind of invigorate a new kind of medical humanities discipline, etc. So I think that's one way of thinking about that. And maybe, the awe that we have for the great novelists is maybe misplaced. But what do you think?
No, I mean,
I know you're struggling with this a little bit, so I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no. I mean,
how do you see that?
I sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, I think, in the discussion, but I think, you're right, Chris. It is a good question. I mean, there's a distinction between awe and admiration. I think. I mean, an admiration of a particular writer, for instance, and awe as a production, an affective kind of quality of the reading experience of a particular scene, right? So, I mean, that's what I don't get. I mean, I can't remember the last time I got that in a novel. Maybe I don't read enough fiction, but there's that kind of visceral awe in admiration of what is happening in front of you in a particular scene is rather different than saying I'm in awe of Toni Morrison, for instance. I mean, as I am. But so that's what I'm interested in is actually the how something like a kind of all-consuming awe can be generated out of something that's linguistically relatively straightforward, which is what these books are, and it's then how we account for the process by which that awe comes about, and what use can it then be put to, and that is historically particular. I mean, I think we are in this moment where we are, in a sense, we are supposed to be in awe of the NHS right now. So if you read these memoirs now, you are going, awe is going to be a prevailing structure of feeling that is both contextual and textual, as it were. But awe isn't a precondition to good criticism. I don't think that you need to be, in gratitude, or you need to reserve any gratitude for your subject. I think it's actually important to, maintain a kind of awareness of of how your feeling is being produced, and always emerging from your own tussle with what the text, how the text is operating, as much as you're relying on a sort of an admiration that you're bringing to the text, that's preconceived. But the subject demands it. I mean, I think that there's no getting away from it, and that's clearly part of what I'm calling their sentimental activism is the production of feeling, or what we call a structure of feeling, right? I mean, the production of a certain kind of feeling in the reader that is linked to particular episodes which are difficult to read against the grain. I'm interested in the way in which they are difficult to read, in ways that allow lots of lateral interrogation, in ways that, that's what we're doing in a novel. So I don't know if that goes anywhere near your question, which is which gets back to kind of the novel and memoir distinction, which is super interesting as well.
Yeah, and more about the figure of the novelist and nurses as people. Right, I think that was really wonderful. It's such a rich kind of area, David. Thank you so much for giving the talk. And I know that we've got people who've been writing their notepads full, and the person who's asking whether this will be recorded, yes, I will send you a link to the CTTR YouTube website where I will upload this conversation shortly, so you can at your leisure come back to all this and have more of debate. I'm sure that David will be happy to answer questions if you approach him. So yeah, if you can all wave to David, I think you've got an option of waving. At least we can do a bit of waving. But thank you so much, David. Just a couple of things. So Sean Matthews got a very interesting kind of link up on the screen about Jill Howey's project on how to think about death. So there is lots going on. It's a very rich field. We wish you all the best with your Levium fellowship. I hope you get a lot done, and I'm sure we will catch up very soon. Thank you again so much. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Bas, and thanks for all your questions. It's been absolutely tremendous to engage with. I mean, this is what these forums are all about. So it's been terrific. Thanks for facilitating this, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, David. Bye.
Yeah, bye.